thank you all very much for coming. I don't know if you've all had time to read this, but it's very interesting. And the methodology that goes into selecting the cities is also very interesting, because it's not just about the quantity of growth, it's a lot about the quality of growth. So in determining the list of cities, you know, there's a lot of thought about job growth, wage growth, how open these cities are to the outside world, looking at human capital and affordability and the ability to evolve and move up the value-added chain. I think that's fair to say.
Very concise.
And one of the things that's interesting to see is how the list changes over time. You know, I want to keep this focused, you know, and not talk about abstract, but talk about specifics of all the cities. And, you know, urbanization is the reason for the Chinese miracle, I think we can say. And it's playing a vital role now in making sure that China does not succumb to the middle income trap, that it does move beyond. And it's vital for, you know, the transformation of China into a service economy, into more value added, into consumption. And as somebody who grew up in a large city, I'm inherently more comfortable in cities. But I mean, a lot of the cities that you come up with here are very counterintuitive in making the list. Could you talk a little bit about Guiyang and why it's scored so well? How many of you have been to Guiyang? Raise your hands if you've been to Guiyang. Not a single person. Very interesting. Chengdu and Chongqing have also done very well. Who's been to both Chengdu and Chongqing? Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
They all like spicy food.
Yeah.
Guiyang has been, as the history goes in China, one of the poorest regions in China, and because it's lack of transportation, high altitude, and literally very sparse populated towns and cities spreading out all over. So it's very difficult to aggregate economic activity. However, that region has a lot of sunlight, fair amount of rainfall, and it's quite beautiful, but it's in high altitude. So it's a city that actually people couldn't think of a reason other than using it as a transit point, because it actually happened to be at the right height and overseeing Indochina. So it was one point was being designed or thought of as a transit point from China to Indochina by French. So that was a brief moment of glory, and then the French helped the Chinese build the first narrow gauge railway from actually central China to Kunming. So that's a middle transit point. Now, why now? So, surprise is the government look at that part of the world, and that happened to be the poorest regions in China. Lack of economic growth, lack of a lot of progress by the modern economics or modern industrialization measure. So the first thing that the Chinese government did was to make a long-term plan to build transit systems. So as of now, there were two high-speed rail line connecting Guiyang to Guangzhou, another one connecting Guiyang to Shanghai, literally sending a very strong signal that the human capital flow and goods flow would go from those two regions, from Pearl River Delta and from Changjiang economic zone all the way to Guiyang. So it is almost a prelude, if you will, that the intention of the Chinese government to exploit the good weather, farmlands or a lot of land, and plenty access to the future market in Southeast Asia. So that's the intention. To me, it's not a surprise because it is one of the access points that without going to the ocean to access Indo-China markets. So pretty straightforward.
You know, I was a student in India 35 years ago, and I went back to eastern Uttar Pradesh for the elections last year, March, April, and I found out the trains are actually 1-2 kilometers slower than when I was a student. The roads are worse. If you look at China, it is so obvious that development and prosperity follow infrastructure, that is the right sequence. Why do you think so many countries don't seem to get that simple fact? I mean, the high-speed rail has been transformative for so many cities in China. And, you know, when I was talking to Perry and Kevin and we were preparing for this panel, you know, we talked about how this China story used to be the East Coast. Now, there's so many stories around regional clusters, some of which are way the hell inland, right? Why do you think that lesson has been so hard for other emerging markets to get?
I think you are getting into a debate that probably very difficult to settle. So you have a central planned economy, and the government decide to draw the blueprints, to draw lines and say we need to change this region, we need to add this industry for the better use of people's resources. But when you have a private land ownership, say California, probably Kevin can elaborate a little bit more on, it would be almost, forget about emerging markets, say in California. You want to build a high-speed rail through Central Valley, the planning process, the EIA process, and then you have to acquire land from farmers, on and on and on. By the time from the planning to the actual construction, it would take probably a decade. So by then, the year mark for a 200 kilometers per hour train is not really high speed because the Chinese, I believe, yesterday they came up with something building and experimenting a high-speed train capable of 1,000 kilometers per hour.
Kevin, let me turn to you. And are there lessons from the U.S., from China? Can infrastructure save some of the dying cities in the U.S.? Can they be the key to revival of the fortunes?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, the U.S. is also sort of an example of how cities can be built up based on infrastructure, much earlier investments of infrastructure, but then the infrastructure wasn't updated, that the linkages were not maintained and grown. One of the things that you see over and over again in history, you see in the U.S., you saw in China hundreds of years ago, you saw in Europe, is that there's this early adopter benefit and penalty. When somebody goes in and captures a technology and puts it into place, it gives tremendous benefits in infrastructure, especially to different regions, and places thrive and they do incredibly well. I mean, if you look at one time, I mean, the economy of Shannon, Ireland, where basically it managed to thrive because it was the last stop that that early airplanes made on their way between Europe and the United States. And once planes were able to bypass Shannon, then suddenly it became a secondary location, and it's a quaint, lovely tourist airport, but it's not this great place that was in fact one of the first inventors of duty-free, because of so many people shopping on their way there. If you look at the United States, there are a number of cities that basically were built because they were in the right location for infrastructure, that water infrastructure and then rail infrastructure as it came along made those cities and made them spectacular. That Buffalo, New York, essentially was created because the Erie Canal connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and the Atlantic Ocean, and Buffalo thrived as an industrial center because of that infrastructure, because of that linkage. But Buffalo was never able to become a great airport center. It's not a natural hub. It's not a natural link. And the rail, and this is a key thing about the U.S. and understanding why rail can be transformative in China. Rail was incredibly transformative and continues to be in some ways in Japan, but not in the U.S., is that in the U.S., passenger rail lost out to freight rail. In most of Europe and in China and in Japan, passenger rail became the important dominant use of rail, while in the U.S. it went the other way, it went to cargo. And a lot of these other places that cargo either went on the water or it went by way of trucks, but that passenger rail has continued to be transformative in creating opportunities and creating centers. And in China, where a lot of these places did not have any great infrastructure, bringing high-speed rail in when the previous infrastructure that existed was inadequate, it makes a tremendous amount of benefits. It means that Guiyang can become suddenly a connected center. Now, in California, there's been a real push to try and build this high-speed rail network and to overcome a lot of these local barriers, these not in my backyards, no, I don't want the agriculture to be disrupted, no, I don't want to sell my land to you. But the cities of Fresno and Bakersfield, which are these agricultural cities that quite honestly are relatively mid to large size, have some real potential, but their infrastructural
Let's
linkages.
just ask how many people in the audience have ever been to Fresno or Bakersfield? Raise your hand. You're not missing anything, let me tell you. Go on. Sorry to interrupt.
No, but if you think about it, is that when the way you describe in terms of Guiyang, in terms of being near agriculture, being near the mountains, admittedly, Fresno isn't up in the mountains, but Fresno likes to sell itself as being the gateway to Yosemite National Park. So much so that its airport actually has these fake sequoia trees in them, just to remind you of that. But it doesn't have those infrastructural linkages. Flying in and out of Fresno is expensive and it's difficult. Flying out of Bakersfield even more so. Bakersfield knows that if high-speed rail were in place, it's an hour commute into Los Angeles, potentially less. And that's close enough to be a striking distance to make a huge difference to its economy. But because of the fact that the rail right-of-ways, because of the fact that a lot of the things that should have been there or should have been exploited were sold off or turned away or are only in the possession of freight lines who have no inclination or desire to be involved in the passenger game, Bakersfield looks at the fact that it hasn't had a rail linkage between itself and Los Angeles since 1971. And it's that close to being connected to being a major international center, and yet it's still not there. And here China looks at it and still has the central authority, but it has a consensus among leaders that infrastructure is still a way to change things. And because the infrastructure that was in these areas was never really built up to the degree needed to transform into a modern economy, the local leadership looks at it and says, we will support this, we will make this happen. And that is important. But in India, where you had a great rail network that was built by the British in the late 1800s and then expanded nationally in the early mid-1900s, they're still essentially sitting on that old style rail network that has served them well for so long. You look at
It hasn't served them well for so long. Do you know what the average, guess what the average speed of a freight train in India is today? A data point that I got from Suresh Prabhu, the Minister of Railways.
15 kilometers an hour?
24. How can you feel good about India's prospects with that data point?
Well, that's the problem, but it serves everybody so well. It's just that what allowed is people to pass that critical point where it stopped serving as well without people figuring out what was that time where they couldn't tolerate it anymore.
Actually, Henny, let me comment. I think we focus on infrastructure. I think one of the fundamental questions we should ask is between the leader and his people. So people outside of China give a lot of credibility to the Chinese leadership by saying they devised this, they they asked for this, they had the vision for this. Ultimately, if you ask me what transformed China in the last 30, 40 years, is a desire to live better, to know that they can do better, they want to be better. So it's
The
not
hunger.
difficult to imagine that Perry Wong, citizen of China, travel in U.S., study for 9 years, going back to China and say, you know what, when I live in Boston, they have this great something. We can do that. And the leader look at it and say, well, does it serve any good function? Oh, yes, okay, let's do it. So you actually are asking people to come up without limitation of imagination and say, we can do this. I think this is what make the society grow or make the leader being pushed to make decision. I think ultimately that, to me, is the root of growth.
I'm going to ask you one yes/no question about infrastructure, and then I'm going to move on unless you have a point that you want to add.
I actually have a big point I want to make off of Perry's, but it's going to lead to a
Go
whole
on.
other direction. No, it's fine. The big thing that Perry's talking about, and this is important both for cities and nationally in terms of the role of the government and the public sector, in some ways, is the assumption of risk and the willingness to take risk and to push change. And in many ways, what you had in China is that you had President Deng being willing to assume economic risk and to change the order for what he wanted to see change to make things better. And
No, the risk was zero, Kevin.
you know,
China was bankrupt in 1978.
yeah, but he
No
still was,
choice.
but that's the other thing we bring up, which is that if you want great transformation, sometimes it has to happen when you feel like you have nothing less to lose. But the truth is that he was still willing to do it. And even when you're bankrupt, a lot of times there are leaders who don't want to take that risk. They don't want to make that change. In California and in much of the U.S., the risk tends not to be on the political leadership. The political leadership, mostly what they do is that they try to stay out of the way and they let the private sector assume most of that risk.
But Kevin, I mean, the problem in the U.S. gets back to what Perry said, as long as we're talking about infrastructure, which is a politician thinks in terms of election cycles, which happen to be 2 years in Congress and 4 years, for a lot of other positions, whereas infrastructure is much more long-term, yeah?
Well, in the U.S., infrastructure has traditionally done well in three circumstances. It's done well when you have a crisis and people have to do something, when there are great new booms in development, so new cities, new places start growing rapid pace, and people have to put the infrastructure in place to keep up, and when there's visionary leadership. The fact is that Dwight Eisenhower got the interstate highway system made. Now, he partly used the justification of defense to make it happen, but it was a massive transformative infrastructure policy that was put all around the country, that was approved through Congress. It happened. The fact is that when a certain number of the great changes in the U.S. have happened, it's because of the fact that people start thinking locally. They start saying, look at the kind of thing I'm building. It's going to create long-term jobs. It's going to put us on the map. It's going to make us special. And the people buy into that. They, even in a multi-year, an ongoing 2-year, 4-year, 6-year, 8-year election cycle, if people buy into a vision and it can be articulated, they're willing to ride it through for a very long time.
So my yes/no question on infrastructure before I move on to the other ingredients here is just to say, will there be a high-speed train between LA and San Francisco? Yes, no?
There will be a better train between LA and San Francisco. Whether or not you call it high speed by the time they're done with it is a completely different question.
Okay, I want to turn now to the whole question of human capital. One of the things that comes out repeatedly in your study, going back to China, is strong education base in the cities and human capital base. Xi'an has done very well in this study. Harbin in the Northeast, in Dongbei, has not done well. So why do some cities, even when they have strong university bases, not make it to this list and others make it to this list?
It's a human capital issue, but also it's economic policy issue.
So human capital is not enough
It's not
by
enough.
itself.
You really have to have the mix, because remember.
And how do you define human capital?
The way I look at it is a commodity. It goes to where higher price would command. So you have, despite Harbin has 3 very national renowned engineering and design
Yeah.
schools, right? Including aerospace design, aeroplane. But the graduate.
Hong Kong
most-
Harbin Institute of Technology.
Correct.
Yeah.
Actually, it was started by the Russians, so there was a strong linkages.
Interesting.
However, the engineer would migrate south.
Because the wages are
The
so much
wages-
higher.
The wages in Shenzhen is far more attractive, although the people from Northeast really hated the weather in Shenzhen. But nonetheless, great wages and air conditioning, just like Singapore would house just about any talents. So from that perspective.
Miami.
The talent does move. But the Northeast of China, the dilemma they got into, has a similar story, at least linked to Detroit or Pittsburgh or some of the Northeast city. When China went into reform, the first thing that the central government decided is that, as I said, there was a bankrupt, not much money to offer on the table. They allow the region in Shenzhen and Shanghai to actually offer substantial better benefit and wages. So a lot of people from Northeast just move, including company.
But you had to get permission when you say they allowed Shenzhen to offer high wages.
Because Shenzhen actually is, they can, as long as they come up with a residential permits, so that they can get people.
Oh, the hukou
So it's
thing
not a
is
matter
how
of they
they
need to
control
convince
that.
people to
I get
come.
it, yeah.
But then it's that they will look at the qualification and say, you are the talent we want. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the bankrupt, I would say, the layoff in manufacturing sector from the moment the Chinese joined WTO, or maybe a year or two before that. In one particular year, in 1 year, the Chinese manufacturing sector lost 5 to 6 million jobs consistently for almost 7 or 9 years. So most of the job are lost from the state-owned enterprises, which concentrated in Northeast. So you have the automotive, you have the aerospace, you have the machinery shops, all those. So those jobs was never recreated in Northeast.
So when you see China saying, we're going to be the leaders in electric vehicles, will these old manufacturing centers give rise to these new models? Or do you think they will spring up in other places that are stronger high-tech centers?
Actually, it's a good question. A Chinese reporter asked me that question when I did the release in Beijing. Her question was, do you believe Chengdu will become the global electric car center? My question, I said, no, I don't know about that. But I said China will be, but I'm not sure about Chengdu. For the reason is simple. The industry orientation is very different. You're talking about city, region industries. So to make a Mercedes or BMW, the 2 most pricey components of productions actually is transmission and engine, and both are made in either Tokyo or somewhere in Germany. The rest, actually, you can assemble them anywhere. But for electric car, anyone can make batteries, and anyone can make chassis. So there's no point to have a very strong cluster. So I said today, maybe Chengdu, tomorrow could be somewhere else. Just as, by the way, since we're on city regions, 20 years ago, all the iPhones were made in one city in China, Shenzhen. 10 years ago, cell phone was made in 2 or 3 Chinese cities, Shenzhen, Tianjin. And today, iPhone is made by probably 5 or 6 cities in China, including one of the top 10 ranked cities, Guangzhou, which is right in the middle of Henan province.
Yeah.
So once the Chinese government decided they want to spread the wealth, they can do so.
There's also a flip side to spreading the wealth, which is that if the cost structure and the ability to attract talent doesn't justify a company moving their resources inland to one of these cities, it also opens up competition to move that manufacturing and some of that technology to somewhere else. Apple is making a point in addition, is that they're now going to be making one model of iPhones in India. And the fact remains that certain other products have moved out of China. They tend to be lower value, but a number of manufacturing products, rather than go inland from the coast, have gone to Vietnam, or they've gone to Cambodia, or they've gone to Bangladesh, or they've gone somewhere else. And that increasing competition means that even if there is a big boom in some of the inland cities, like they run into the same problem a number of American cities have found, is that you're not just competing against China, you're not just in the US, you're competing against the world. And as you keep on moving in terms of what your targets are, and you move higher up the food chain in terms of what kind of products you're making and what kind of industries you're trying to thrive in, you have to realize that your competition isn't just within your own country or your own region. It gets a lot further than that. And it also means that once you pass a certain threshold of growth, if you're Guiyang and you're said, okay, we're no longer at the bottom, we've now moved to the mid-level, we've had a couple really good years, and we want to move up, and we want to compete against Hangzhou, we want to compete against Shenzhen, we want to compete against Silicon Valley. How do we do that? And making that next jump is often a lot harder, and it's one of the reasons why Shenzhen is so amazing as an example.
I want to keep on the subject of the human capital and education for a bit longer. Obviously, we all know that Stanford is such a vital place in the whole branding of California and tech and tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question for you, Perry, is will a Tsinghua, a Beida, a Jiaoteng, a Fudan ever close the gap with Stanford?
I would say no.
Why?
Use the current matrix that we have. No, they will never be.
Let's just say, how many of you agree that there will always be a gap between a Stanford and the leading universities of China? Raise your hand if you think that Stanford will be, unique, and that Chinese universities will not close the gap. Who believes that Chinese universities will not close the gap?
I think you need to be a little more
Interesting.
specific on closing the gap, because Fudan University is a great university. It's a university that, in terms of research, in terms of resources, in terms of the people who are produced out of it, can close much of that gap. But what makes Stanford really important in terms of the branding is the entrepreneurship that goes with it. It's the spin-offs that come out of that university in terms of how the intellectual property is shifted. And just
Why can't Chinese universities replicate that? I agree with you, absolutely agree with you, but why can't Chinese universities
Well, you have to change the law.
replicate
And it's something, that's also where policy comes in, and it's also where culture comes in, is that there are two things that come in. One is that you had something in the US that was passed years ago called the Bayh-Dole Act, about universities sharing in the proceeds of intellectual property when they got shifted to the private sector. And this partnership that came in that's been incredibly successful.
Isn't legend like that?
Actually, my answer is a lot more straightforward. Forget about the patent law, forget about culture. You only need to look at the students. What makes Stanford great? This is not Stanford, it's the students. Look at the global student body in Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, you name it. And look at Tsinghua, Beida, and their student mix. Then you will know.
So
But-
let me ask you a follow-up question.
Actually, I'd like to finish mine,
Oh,
since
sorry,
Perry interrupted me on that one. But it's just but the reason I think it still comes back to culture and everything else is that, why do the international students come? And you're right, there's a certain amount of it is that Chinese universities are still about Chinese students. They're not, that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily come. That may change. That is possible that it's time that may change, but there are two things that go. The other thing is, as they say about risk and about entrepreneurship, is that if you go to Stanford and you get a job in Silicon Valley, you can start your own company. You can get capital to start your own company. You can, as the dot-com bubble showed, is that there can be capital for some of the more absurd concepts going. But the fact is that if you fail coming out of Stanford, you'll get a chance to try again. If you fail coming out of a leading Chinese university, you don't necessarily get a chance.
No, you got disowned by your parents first.
Yeah.
No, just kidding.
But that's where I think the culture comes in, and that's the attraction of people coming into a number of these universities, is that they feel like that they are going to get the connections and the opportunity where they might not otherwise. There is also that language issue in the fact that, for good or for ill, English is viewed as an international language. Mandarin is not viewed as an international language. Mandarin is viewed as a language of China, and people learn Mandarin, they learn Putonghua because they want to do business with China. And that is an important distinction.
So let me keep going on this for 1 or 2 more minutes. So there's a very famous physics professor at Stanford from Beijing, Professor Zhang. Many people think he will one day win a Nobel Prize. I asked Professor Zhang, why did you come to Stanford? And he said, because when I applied for a research grant in China, I was told, but you didn't go to the party meeting last week. And his thing is, research grants in China are a function of loyalty to the party, not merit. A, Perry, do you share that view? B, is it changing? And if it's not changing yet, do you think it may soon change?
Wow, this is an awfully difficult question to answer. Since I was never a party member, never participated in academic exercise in China. I think things will change. I'm always optimistic in China, I think, because it is changing. So they are not fixated on ideology, I think, not as strong. So things would change. But I think the bureaucracy is always the case in China. I have heard story that if you're not a party member, your promotion, forget about getting a grant, it's actually somewhat limited. So it is the case. It's not necessarily party loyalty, but I think more to whether you can be connected to the leadership. I think I would interpret it that way, rather than the party cadet per se. But
Kevin, I have a question for you now. You know, you are always mentioning, you know, one of the great strong points of California is the immigration. How concerned are you that this incredible competitive advantage of California is under threat, given the current administration in Washington?
I think that it's always going to be a concern because of the fact that California especially, it's not only dependent on immigration, fundamentally immigration has been driving the population of California for a few decades. If you look at California, it's actually had a net outflow of people from the state of California to the rest of the United States fairly consistently since the early 1990s. There have only been a few years where it's been a net inflow. What is different about it is that fundamentally you're attracting the best and the brightest, and sometimes right now, given California, those are the only people who can afford to live in and buy a house in the state, certainly along the coast. But any disruption to that retention of talent does put California as a potential competitive disadvantage. And quite honestly, there's been aspects of that disruption going back to 2001, that when restrictions were put into place in terms of the kind of visas that students graduating from California universities were able to get, the retention of international students has consistently been a struggle and an issue. In many cases, you look at Stanford, you look at UC Berkeley, you look at University of Southern California, UCLA, UC San Diego, and so on. They have been educating many of the best and the brightest and some of the greatest entrepreneurs and innovators in East Asia, and have done so fairly consistently. And sometimes those connections are of great benefit, but a lot of times they wind up essentially educating and developing California's greatest competitors. And if more of the greatest, the highest achieving, most ambitious students are afraid to come to California, or if they feel that their prospects aren't worth even trying to stay and they decide that they're just going to go back home, it absolutely creates a risk. And in China, as you mentioning with Harbin, is that if people don't feel like they have their opportunities where they're being educated, they will go to where they view those opportunities. That is true within China. That is true internationally.
Thank you. I'm going to turn slowly now to a city that doesn't come up here, which is Hong Kong. So I am from New York. I thought the best thing that Mayor Bloomberg did was come to the conclusion that it's not just enough to be an international financial center anymore. And we've had a lot of data all morning about the extent to which the banking sector is shrinking. What is the future of Hong Kong, which has always positioned itself as an international financial center and the beneficiary of the arbitrage from capital controls in China? Are you optimistic about Hong Kong? Does Hong Kong need to reinvent itself?
Hong Kong does need to reinvent itself. Looking back in time, for the most 70 years in the past, Hong Kong ran on a monopoly. So the only in Asia, the only to China. So given the rise of Shenzhen, Shanghai, Guangzhou, all the surrounding cities currently are doing a lot better than Hong Kong.
And why is that?
Well, it like I said, sometime when you're in a competition, when you want to do better, the position of being in hunger actually give you a lot of edge. So Shenzhen actually, a lot of people commented in Shenzhen. Shenzhen actually carry the DNA of Hong Kong in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
That hunger.
They want to make it. They want to prove that they will do better. Some of the Hong Kong entrepreneur, the Shenzhen entrepreneur, actually came out to say, we are not Silicon Valley of California. We do better, because
I agree with that, by the way.
I don't
Go on.
necessarily agree with you. So in that sense, now the central government just laid out one of the most ambitious urban cluster planning, which is to link up Hong Kong, Macau, Zhuhai, and the entire south quadrant of Guangdong, including Guangzhou, Shenzhen, loop it into a what they call the super Bay
Area,
economy.
yeah.
So Hong Kong is going to be the only one element in it.
How optimistic are you on that? So I attended the inaugural, introduction of that concept to Hong Kong. And Pony Ma from Tencent, as you all know, spoke at 2 panels. Panel number 1, the Hong Kong person was New World Development, a property company. Panel number 2, the Hong Kong person was Henderson Land. What is Hong Kong's contribution? Oh, we'll build you a building to put your incubator in. How optimistic are you that this will transform Hong Kong, that Hong Kong can contribute something other than another cyberport?
Not
Property development,
not
not
optimistic,
disguised as high
because
tech.
I think they still missed the point. 20 years ago, they missed the point on high tech, so they make it a real estate play. And then now, it looks to me, they are going to repeat the same thing again. So in terms of space, cheaper space for biotech, life science, and electronic research, you need space. Hong Kong is not known to have a lot of cheap space, but Shenzhen and Dongguan and Guangzhou, they all have it. So in that, they are not the advantage. And Hong Kong does offer 2 very strong universities, Hong Kong U and UST.
Chinese U?
But yeah, all 3, okay. But the 2 actually are very strong in engineering. So can they compete with the university in China, which tie closer to the enterprises, meaning the actual companies? So if they can, yes. But if Hong Kong fail to adapt to that, then Hong Kong probably will make this technology boom as another real estate play. That's my concern. So I'm not too optimistic, but Hong Kong does offer something that mainland China does not have, which is a very strong IP protection. And also it's a freer society, if you will, in both exchange of information and also allow the researcher to go crazy. Right? So that actually is very important.
Well, I was in, this time I was in Hong Kong. One of the interesting ads I saw was an ad promoting the new higher speed rail link, more direct rail link from Hong Kong into Guangzhou. And making a point of how, and it contrasted two businessmen, both of whom had meetings in Guangzhou, and one using the old system where you basically have to go to 2 or 3 different stations and change a couple different times and hustling like crazy just to try and get to the meeting. And the other guy saying, oh, you know, checking, leaving 20 minutes later, getting there 20 minutes earlier, looking nice and relaxed, and how much of a difference. And I thought it was interesting because it was this recognition that important meetings are happening in Guangzhou. And
Very interesting interpretation.
And
So true.
but also it was an interesting thing that I think that's going to be important is that a number of years ago, if you're just going to look at in contrast in California, is that the gap between San Francisco and San Jose in terms of transportation, in terms of difference, was a big deal, and all of the great deals were happening in San Jose, in the heart of Silicon Valley. They're all happening down in Silicon Valley. And San Francisco was a finance center and is a city that's expensive with buildings and real estate plays and everything like that, and no space. And yet, suddenly, what happened was that people realized that they liked the lifestyle in San Francisco, that they thought that the culture was better, that the opportunities that were being afforded in San Francisco were better, and they were willing to pay a premium and live in smaller space to be in San Francisco. And suddenly, Facebook was putting everybody in San Francisco. Suddenly, Google was realizing that even if people were working down in Silicon Valley, they were going to be doing buses or getting people on trains or doing things and making those links. For Hong Kong, what they have, it's not a too late situation because Hong Kong has to recognize that attracting the people and giving a lot of the tech entrepreneurs, the smaller companies, the various people, and maybe in some ways the cultural cutting edge, and attracting those people into Hong Kong is still very, very possible. But they have to embrace that linkage more directly with this new rail links, with the new ties between Hong Kong and Shenzhen, between Hong Kong and Guangzhou, in order to say, we're the place you want to live, even if you're necessarily going to work somewhere else, or we're the place that certain companies just want to be because the social ties, the cultural ties can thrive in a certain way in Hong Kong in a way that they might not otherwise.
And Kevin, do you think that New York can succeed as a tech center, as a startup center?
Well, it's in some ways it's actually done far better than anybody gave it credit to. New York
And why is that?
Because it's the place where it happens, so to speak. Is that people, people want to be in the city where they think things are actually happening. And New York has that, and there's a certain amount of the cultural, social connections, there's a certain amount of the opportunity connections where they found, it's one of the things they found in the dot-com bubble, and then they saw it repeated, and they coming out after that and coming after 9/11 is that a lot of the firms that were attracted to lower Manhattan were tech-related firms, that filling the void. At the time, there was a need to attract people into the area, but New York has it's one of the other places in the U.S. for obvious reasons that there's access to capital, that people are willing to reach out to newer technology firms. But New York is able to attract people looking for their opportunities. And it's proven surprisingly much more easy for New York to make itself a bit of a tech center. I can't say it is the tech center. It is still, I would put New York further down the road than some others. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but if I may, just one question. As you're talking about New York, you're talking about Hong Kong, Macau, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Shanghai to the north. How do you view Tokyo in all of this, the opportunities, the competitive scenario, and the foreseeable future?
Well, Tokyo has some of the blessings and curses. Tokyo has great universities, absolutely. Tokyo's universities have been making more of an effort to attract international talent to them to come and attend. But the issue that really is can the newer entrepreneurs and newer technology companies, do they get an opportunity in Tokyo? Is the environment there for them to sort of thrive? Who's going to give them capital? Who's going to give them an opportunity? And the real issue for Tokyo, more than anything else, is will the already existing environment, the extended keiretsu, the various other business establishment, business linkages and networks that are there, are they going to let that opportunity actually happen? Because I think the talent is absolutely there. I think the money is there. The question is the opportunity for those companies to grow? Otherwise, what you do is that you get a situation where a decision is made that Japan absolutely has the talent, but do the companies decide that in order to thrive, they need to go somewhere else, and they need to go to the US, or they need to go another part of Asia, or maybe what they do is if they manage to get just the nucleus in Tokyo, but the expansion all happens somewhere else in Asia.
Perry, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think people so often not talk too much about urban development in Japan, but some of the great idea actually we talk about now was written by a former McKinsey consultant who also later served in the McKinsey Global Institute, who wrote a book on the concept that city, not nation, counts in the future. So if you go by that linkages or that kind of argument, the book literally said, how you want to make a city or your country relevant is to tap your city into the global trade, global exchange of idea, global flow of talents. So everything that you tap into, so that would make your home base stronger. If you look at Japan's economic development in the last, since 86, 87, the model has been they capture growth outside. So if you look at Japan's GDP and GNP, it's quite interesting. So they have a lot of production outside. They would buy into sticks and companies in Europe, China, Asia, everywhere. Their production linked outside. So the relevancy of Tokyo is you can look at it as a hub for the Japanese economy and hub in Asia. So that's how I interpret it. So they are slightly different than the notion that we talk about Hong Kong or Shenzhen or Shanghai.
Do you live
They are
in
on their own
Tokyo?
rank.
No, now I live here. I was in Shanghai before and in Tokyo prior.
And what is your view on innovation in Japan?
I'm just wondering, to the previous point as to respectively, if there's enough pressure there, whether there could be enough hunger for them to wake up after decades of relatively stagnant development when you compare it to some of the others.
They are not hunger, but they have the urgency.
Yeah.
That is a very interesting thing. I'm just going to say one thing because I lived in Japan for many years. And the reason I'm more skeptical has to do with, I'll give you two anecdotes. I have very close friends at Sloan Kettering, and they are world-class researchers in pancreatic cancer. And when they give lectures at Todai, at Tokyo University, the people in the audience ask questions according to seniority. That means the people who know the least are taking up the most time. And they have started saying it's a waste of time for us to go to Japan because we're not having interesting discussions with the real specialists. You know, I lived in Japan during the bubble years. Hitachi had a world-class research institute at Tsukuba, and they were trying to attract scientists from all over the world and pay them so much money. And I would be asked to meet with people from Jet Propulsion Lab and NASA and Caltech who were going there, and one by one they all left. They felt like the hierarchical culture, the emphasis on rote, was so much. So I am a little more skeptical, but I wondered.
It's culturally so deep, and yet again I want to believe that over the next decade or two, that with a necessity and the next generations in workforce motivation, that something will happen. It can't stay like this forever.
Well, in
Kevin.
some reasons, we were talking before we started, we were talking about the rebirth of the city of Pittsburgh. And that Pittsburgh is a notorious case where by the 1980s in the US, Pittsburgh was viewed as literally as a pit, as a place that people didn't want to go, that it was this great industrial city, this steel city. It was the greatest center of steel manufacturing in the United States. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Pittsburgh was one of the most innovative cities in the United States. And yet people had become so retrenched and so stuck in their ways that they had essentially seen a city that was in decline from the 1950s all the way into the 1980s. That it had just slowly but surely declined. The population of the city declined, the role of the city had declined, the companies had declined because of the fact that they're all trying to preserve the status quo that wasn't preservable. And it got to the point where they sort of went back and they looked and they said, what are we doing well? We have Carnegie Mellon, we have Duquesne University, we have a few great universities, we've got Pitt, we're innovative in computing, which is something that they had been. It turned out to be innovative in robotics. They turned out to have very good in certain life sciences and health skills. And they built on that and they rebuilt the city. And it is now it is a dramatically better city. It's a great city to actually visit and nice city, a good city to live in. They've built it back up, but it had to some degree get to the point where they gave up on what their role had been, and they had to give up on a certain amount of the things that weren't still working that they were trying to preserve. One of the points that somebody made to me about Japan, and one of the real issues is that, and I've heard this a few times, is that Japan is still holding on to a bunch of these bad loans in these older structures that essentially stopped performing well in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and yet that the preservation is there. Japan has incredible talent and incredible resources, but to some degree they have to let the older elements that aren't working go to be able to move on. If you're as much as grief as people sometimes give about Nintendo is a company, who made playing cards in the 1800s. It's reinvented itself multiple times, and even in video games has reinvented itself multiple times, but it had to realize that things were sliding or falling apart before it was willing to take the risk and do something new again. And it's for Tokyo and for what's going on is that to some degree you have to have sectors of the economy where people are willing to take greater risks and greater leap. And I agree that to some degree it's going to happen sooner rather than later. And people are, the issue that you also look into Japan in terms of cities, people keep moving into the cities looking for opportunities. You go to some of the smaller cities and towns in Japan, and their average age of the people living there is now 65 or 70. And that's because they're looking for those opportunities. So I expect that something will happen, but to some degree it's cultural. And I think that for somewhere like Hong Kong, and in some cases, or Harbin, or somewhere where you're looking at it and you're either trying to preserve the status quo or you're trying to preserve a glory period that's already passed, you have to stop and say, you know what, it's time to take a risk and reinvent ourselves, or at least look at where we're strong and build that up and be willing to stop trying to support the structures that aren't working as well anymore.
I want to, Anne, please go ahead.
I wanted to get back to your point, Henny, about Hong Kong and Hong Kong's future. And I guess it's, anyway, I think one of the areas that maybe we've overlooked or should be a focal point is the fact that Hong Kong is actually turning into a bright spot in terms of its cultural development in the arts and culture. For example, all of the auction houses. Hong Kong is the center for Asia. They're tremendously active. Art fairs have just exploded in the last few years, and you go to the major art fairs, Art Basel, and you see hordes of people from mainland China and from other cities coming in, and you see development finally of the West Kowloon cultural district. You see the old police headquarters that's now going to be open very soon. You see world-class leaders, artistic directors now coming in with the Hong Kong Ballet and the Hong Kong Symphony, the Philharmonic is still, So I think this is an area that is a bright spot for Hong Kong.
That's a
And one
wonderful
thing that
point.
can be differentiated, particularly with the freer flow of information and ideas that still takes place in Hong Kong.
Thanks. We're running out of time, but I did want to ask, one of the points that both of you kept making to me is, what is interesting is to ask which of the names will be persistent over time. When we come back next year or in 5 years to the Milken Summit in Singapore, will the names look very different? But what I wanted to ask you, Perry, is this. Does technology mean that the competitive advantage of a city today, is harder and harder to retain? Or is it once you get that critical mass, you keep it? How do you see it? Does technology help today's winners or give, new entrants a better chance?
Actually, we did look at, because I have done this for the last 30 years now from regional economics. The city is not about technology. It's not just pure human capital, because you think those things, those are elements, and they can flow out and in. It actually has a lot to do with the city regions have the ability to reinvent themselves. Shenzhen, everyone now knows Shenzhen as one of the most prosperous city in China. But if you look at the wage characteristic and growth from the end of the 90s all the way to 2005, real wage in Shenzhen grew very little. That's actually exactly the time the city needed to learn the lessons. You have to be innovative. So without the central government's support, Shenzhen literally find ways to regenerate. And then the entrepreneur, that's point number one. Point number two, they welcome just all sort of what I call crazy people, from China, elsewhere in China, and then now global. They welcome them.
Yeah, I feel
Right,
that
so-
Shenzhen is a really
Yeah, it's
national
a-
city, people from all over China.
Right, so the only dialect that people shy away from talking is Cantonese. But actually, that's in
Says a
Guangdong province.
former
Yeah.
So,
Guangzhou
so
port.
it's about ability to regenerate. So it's not technology per se, it's not about nice location per se. That helps, but then, it's reinventing. I think same story as Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and if you don't reinvent yourself, if you're not willing to take that chance, then you stagnate. And if you look at San Jose, which is a city that, it's in an area that's called Silicon Valley. It's called Silicon Valley because that literally what it was. It was the center of silicon chip manufacturing. It was a manufacturing center of wafers of silicon chips. That's not there anymore. The Intel, the main company that was the silicon chip manufacturer, it has moved its manufacturing up to Oregon or to near Portland or to Phoenix, Arizona, or the AMD has moved a lot of its chip manufacturing to Germany or to Texas. And yet, it reinvented itself in terms of being a software center, in terms of being a innovative center for design, for some cases electric vehicles, in some cases it's you've got this tremendous partnership that developed with NASA, with the NASA Ames Center that's right there in San Jose. A lot of these things have happened where it doesn't get enough credit for embracing change and for making sure that it stays current, because one of the really hard things is that when you're that innovator in that first wave, you have that early adopter penalty. You did everything first, you were great, but if you're stuck with that first generation of innovations, and if you're not able to adapt yourself, which Shenzhen has proven that it's capable of doing, or even looking at Shanghai, which has managed to reinvent itself in a couple different ways, then you rise up in these indices, you do well for a few years, but once your one trick or maybe your two tricks are exhausted, you will drop back down. And that's why it's important that you look at the cities that are managed to stick and are there.
Thank you. I
Okay.
think we're going to run out of time. We
Yeah.
have like 1 minute left. Is there anyone in the audience who wants to make a final comment before we all race for the elevators?
I just want to share two comments.
Thank you.
One about the Chinese university. I think the problem with the Chinese comparison to overseas university now is not quite relevant. Chinese universities are all state-sponsored, state-funded.
But you are beginning to see private universities established. You know, one of the Tencent Holdings 5 founders endowed a university in Wuhan, one of the first private
Well, I was
universities.
gonna say, so I'm what's equivalent to a senator of Hubei province. And Wuhan is
Yes.
the largest capital city of Hubei. And Hubei traditionally has been the major source of university graduates. We have the largest number of universities concentration in the entire country. I think every year we have something like 200,000 graduates.
And also you have the most beautiful campus.
And it's wonderful. The problem or the challenge we're facing with Wuhan is we attract students from all across China, and it's highly competitive. They come here, they educate, they get into various universities, and after they're done with the education, they all leave. So our challenge is to retain talent, and like Perry said, talent follow the money. And right now, Wuhan does not offer enough job opportunities to attract and retain these talents. And even though, well, unfortunately, Wuhan didn't make the top 10 best performing cities, but we did have, we were ranked number 8 in terms of GDP growth last year. The mayor and the party sector is really happy about that. But for us, going forward, it's how to invest in such a way that we can continue our economic growth. In the last 5 years, a lot has been invested in infrastructure. So we have the new subway system that's opening. So it's been a mess around town logistics. But now for the next 5 years, we have a new party secretary, and he is focusing in economics. His background is actually not government, but from the private sector.
That's great.
That helps.
Thank you.
Actually,
I think
let me
time is
add
up.
very quickly. In the early days of reform, many of the senior advisor at that time in the 80s, they are all graduates, fine graduates of Wuhan Dashi. Actually, they are known to be very open and reform-minded scholars.
Thank you so much, and thank you all
Great to
so
see.
much